The second presenter is Yanbin Wang from the University of Chicago. He'll be talking about the LVP facilities at GSECARS. So take it away.
Thanks, Tony. Uh, so the LVP program at GSECARS is one of the several techniques available. Tony and I are directly responsible for this program, but we get support from all of the GSE staff over the last 20 some years. And the great synergy actually has really helped us in developing this program. The outline is shown down here. I'd like to start by discussing the roles of LVP in earth science research as an introduction. All right, so basically LVP is a complementary technique to the diamond cell and dynamic compression. And one of the major advantages of this technique is the ability to characterize complex multi-phase materials. This is very important for earth sciences because we know that seismic velocities, convection patterns, melting and melt segregation all involve multi-phase materials in the earth. And these processes in turn affect materials properties. For example, by applying a shear strain, one can change the texture dramatically from a necrojet specimen like on this sample to the next one. And this texture change, again, changes the seismic anisotropy, changes rheology, which in turn affect dynamic processes. And so LVP research largely follows what I call the material science processes. So here we're really interested in the interplay among structure, processing, properties, and performance of the material. For the Earth, the processing actually is done by the Earth machine, and we can only observe dynamic responses from the surface. But we want to understand the interplay of these four aspects to be able to play important constraints to the Earth problems. So over the years, we have developed several LVP systems at GSECARS, focusing on studies of various types of properties. Each system is focusing on specific types of properties and dynamic process of materials. And here shown is the map of our sector. We have the bending magnets, beamlines shown as in blue, and ID beamline shown as in orange. So we have a 250-ton press in the bending magnet beamline 1390 BMD. We have a 1,000-ton press sharing with the diamond cell at 13 IDD. We actually have swapped our PE cell with the HP CAD. We use their PE cell in IDC, and HP CAD has been using our PE cell in our system. To maximize versatility and flexibility, we adopted what I call the Swiss Army knife approach. So we have, for each given press, we have multiple high pressure modules that are available, which can be used for different purposes. Each module specializes into a set of specific experiments. We built flexible detector supports behind the presses to accommodate various diffraction conditions. In what follows, I'll give a brief overview of some technical capabilities at GSECARS, and this will be shown along with scientific highlights. Then I will be talking about some future directions. Don has described the D-dia very well, so I won't spend so much time on this. The difference between our D-dia setup with that at sector 6 and at NSL2 is that we use a monochromatic diffraction with the area detector. We have two D-dia systems. The use of them depending on the sample size. The samples up to about ½ an inch in length can be studied. And the diffraction of monochromatic diffraction provides full Debye rings, as indicated in this image here, for accurate stress measurements. And these can be decomposed, and then we analyze the individual diffraction lines at very small 2 theta ranges. The devices are used for study both in the plastic regime for flow laws and also for brittle deformation to understand earthquake physics. So here's an example of a sintered two-phase rock, which is a mixture of calcium germanate perovskite and MgO. This is prepared after a breakdown reaction from CaMgGeO4 olivine. You can compare it with the silicate counterpart. You can see that both the microstructure and volumetric fractions of the two phases are very similar. And the figures on the right shows that we are able to measure individual stress states in the two materials simultaneously. The red symbols are germanate perovskite. The black symbols are for MgO. You can see the stresses are quite different at different pressure, temperature conditions during deformation. These stress and strain curves were obtained in a single experiment. And for each stress strain curve, we could actually get the bulk strains measurements, get an average stress and strain curve for the samples. In addition, monochromatic diffraction actually allows close tracking of texture development throughout the experiment. So here's an example of texture at about 28% strain obtained on similar samples. For germanate perovskite, the inverse pole figures here show that the grains tend to have their 010 planes normals aligned parallel to the compression axis, with the secondary maximum close to 110. The MgO grains, on the other hand, show much weaker texture. Now, if we look at the microstructure after the experiments, we can see the development of shear bands as indicated, some of the indicated by these red dashed lines. These bands are dominated by MgO, which indicates which actually explains this weakening in the stress strain curve at strains about 25% or so. This is a good example of texture influence on multi-phase materials during deformation. By employing acoustic emission transducers on the back of the D-dia animals, we're able to study brittle deformation and detect nano earthquakes in the laboratory. Here's an example of Mg2GeO4 olivine, which is an analog to silicate olivine. Previous studies have shown that metastable olivine in the spinel field exhibits very complex mechanical behavior. At low temperature, the metastable olivine is strong and ductile. At high temperature, it is weak and ductile. But in the intermediate range temperature, the material is brittle and generates microscopic faulting. So with Alex Chouvenel's group at ENS Paris, we studied the transformational faulting process in this system. And we found that at this temperature range, corresponding to the blue field, when olivine begins to transform to a spinel, as indicated by these spinel little faces in here, little peaks in there, samples emit large amount of acoustic emission events, and all of which are located inside the cylinder of sample. And from these observations, we can discuss the mechanisms of transformational faulting mechanism. Working with Lupi Zhu's group at San Luis University, we applied seismological relocation algorithm to improve location of the AE events. We improved the location accuracy by about a factor of 20. And this allows us to track AE activities during deformation during the failure. So here we plot the movies show the events along this fault on the recovered samples. As you can see, in the beginning of the deformation process, you have these small events popping in the planes, and followed by some quite large events near the end, which is the cause of the microscopic failure. Essentially, all of the events are double couple or CLVD mechanisms, as indicated by these beach ball focal mechanism maps inside the sample. The seismological tools also allowed us to uncover 10 times more events using a template matching technique. And this allows us to define a better trend for the B values for these nano earthquakes. Furthermore, we've studied the frequency dependence of these A events. This is in collaboration with seismologist Zhongwen Zhang at Caltech. Seismic rupture models show that corner frequencies of seismic events decreases with the increased seismic moment over a very large broad range, about over 20 orders magnitude. Our analysis show that events in our small samples, millimeter size samples, seem to follow the same trend. This is really intriguing because it seems like the relationship appears to be independent of details of the rock types, independent of sample sizes and physical mechanisms. And this is help us to understand the scaling issues in the earthquake studies. This is, of course, this is not a settled issue, but it provides some useful clues for understanding this relationship. Now we move on to high pressure tomography. This is a technique initiated at GSECARS and now has been adopted by other synchrotron light sources. We've seen a couple of examples in earlier talks. So at GSECARS, one of the popular applications is to study texture evolution during torsional shear experiments. And so the left figure movie here shows a sample with initially well-separated FES blobs inside silicate olivine, which has been digitally removed. After a shearing strain of about 10 at high pressure and temperature, the molten FES blobs are forced into these shearing bands, inclined at an inclined angle about 15 to 20 degrees or so. And this is the PhD work of Casey Todd at RPI with whose supervisor was Heather Watson. She also applied the lattice Boltzmann analysis to constrain permeability for this kind of textures. The results have been used to model the formation process of the Earth's core. Another application is to image volume of non-crystalline materials to measure density and construct equilibrium state. This has been touched upon by Nicola in his talk earlier for Soleil synchrotron. For us, this is particularly useful for high viscosity melts. Here is an example of a volume rendering for liquid jadeite. This is the work by Mang Zhu when he was a PhD student at Case Western Reserve University. So the figure here summarizes the results. You can see that the volume rendering as shown by the black dots are consistent with molecular dynamic simulations. The 2D absorption measurements sometimes may be frowned by background noise, so sometimes the data are not so reliable. The combination of both techniques as proposed by Nicola would be a better way to do this experiments. This technique has also been used to study equilibrium state of silicate glasses, for example, in the PhD work of Alicia Clark at UC Davis. For low velocity liquids, one can use ultrasonic technique to measure relaxed acoustic velocities. This slide shows the results of a diopside liquid. During heating on this, we heat a glass sample at high pressure. The glass crystallizes partially and then partially melt, eventually completely melts into liquid. After completed melting, the shear modulus contribution disappears. So the P wave becomes bulk sound speed. And then we see this large drop in the velocities. The velocity is determined by these travel times, and sample length imaging shows a very different pressure dependence compared to the crystalline diopside and diopside glasses. The data quality is, in this case is quite well because we can tightly constrain bulk modulus and K prime simultaneously. Combining the diopside liquid data with the previous shown JDI data to represent basaltic melt, the study by Xu et al. Suggests that basaltic liquid around 250 and 400 kilometer depth may be gravitationally neutral. So they may be stable at this depth. Now, physical properties of liquid are controlled by their structures, and the structure of the liquids are more difficult to study due to the highly disordered nature. For silicates, the low Z nature makes it even more difficult to study. We have been collaborating with beamline scientists at HPCAT, particularly with Guoying Shen and Yoshio Kono for a long time to conduct multi-angle energy dispersive and structure measurements at sector 16. And recently, we've set up a monochromatic system in 13 IDC, shown in this slide. So in collaboration with Vitaly, Peter, and Joanne at GSECARS, we mounted the PE cell in the center of the general purpose diffractometer. We mount a single photon counting area detector for data collection. And we use the multi-channel collimator as shown by Vitaly here to cut down the background scattering. This MCC was actually based on the advice from Mohammed Mizur from ESRF. So thank you, Mohammed, for your input. So we use either silica 111 or 311 to deliver a monochromatic beam, which is then focused by two mirrors to deliver a 30 by 60 micron beam into the sample. The slit arrays in the multi-channel collimator is selected such that for a 1 millimeter diameter sample, the background is totally cut off at 2 theta angles above 10 degrees or so. And the intensity effect of the MCC can be corrected using calibration experiments. This slide shows the data collected by Yangjae Ryu at GSECARS on 4 different pyroxene compositions, liquid, all at around 2 GPa or so. And after converting S of Q into G of R, one can see that different elements, metals like magnesium, calcium, and iron contribute differently to the G of R. With calcium in the system, you can see in the wollastonite liquid, SiO peak and the CaO peak are well separated. In the other situations, you have this MgO or FeO peaks under the main peak as on the right-hand side as a slight shoulder. But this main peak can be considered as a represent the bound distance for between silicate and oxygen. For anesthetic liquid, we have studied this up to about 10 GPa, and you can see liquid structure changes very subtly from near zero pressure to 10 GPa. To compare with the glass, anesthetic glass, and the liquid behaves very differently. So the red symbol shows the liquid behavior of the first peak, which is mostly SiO. The pressure dependence is very shallow, which is consistent with the molecular dynamics calculation from Kim et al. The glass samples, on the other hand, shows a much steeper increase with some jumps at some pressures. At about 20 GPa, the SiO bound distance is very similar to akimotoite, which is a 6-coordinated silicate. The liquid, on the other hand, is dominated by 4 coordination and 5 coordination. So one has to be very careful in applying glass data to liquid in understand the liquid behavior in the Earth's mantle. And currently, we are designing new anvils, try to push the system to higher pressures. And this particular technique will probably benefit most in large volume press for after APSU. Then we can increase the intensity and decrease the beam size to obtain more accurate structure data with shorter time. So now I will talk about a few directions currently being developed. To continue with the liquid scheme, Ann Palmier at UC San Diego, now at Carnegie, has contributed a solartron impedance meter to GSECARS. Together, we developed a system for measuring electrical conductivity, particularly focusing on liquids. So Kurt Landenweber at ASU has involved in developing a four-wire measurements circuitry in the 14-8 cell assembly. As a proof of concept experiments, the data on the lower right shows the electrical conductivity measurements at 2 GPa during heating on this composition. The system undergoes a number of phase transformations which are associated with some dips in the electrical conductivity until the sample is totally molten. You can see the effect of the structural change and melting on conductivity. The same cell assembly also has been used to measure the viscosity using falling sphere techniques, as shown by this screen captures of one particular composition during melting. So this preliminary results show that it is feasible that in some cases we can actually simultaneously measure the electrical conductivity and viscosity, and therefore providing more properties of melts to better constrain melt distribution and mobility in the Earth. In collaboration with Tahar Hamouda at Pascal University, we're developing techniques to study degassing processes of carbonated silicates. It is well known that the solidus of carbonated silicates show this steep change in the solidus. This is known as the carbonate ledge. When the melt is decompressed, crossing this ledge, CO2 escapes with huge volume changes, resulting in violent eruptions. The high pressure tomography technique can be used to monitor this in the laboratory. So during isothermal decompression at about 1200 degrees C, we can see that in the middle part of the sample, in the sample part here, the brighter contrast, you can see the little bubbles showing and escaping into pressure medium at some point. With acoustic emission transducers mounted on the side of the parasanibar anvils, we're able to detect this degassing induced little pops during experiments. So we could actually locate most of the events inside the sample, which are correlated with the observed bubbles in the samples quite well. This technique can be used to simulate volcanic activities and energetics in the laboratory, and the imaging portion of it can be used also for partial melting and melt distribution studies under torsional shear experiments. And Peter was talking about going smaller and smaller in sample size. One of our directions is actually going larger and larger in sample size to bridge the gap between high pressure mineral physics and low pressure communities such as rock deformation communities and critical zone studies. We've developed large cell assemblies in the D-dia-30 to conduct several experiments on transformational faulting. Here is again the MG2 G04 sample, but it's 6 millimeter in diameter and 12 millimeter long. The sample is from Harry Green's lab. At 4 GPa, as the sample was temperature was jumped from 600 degrees to 900 degrees, kinetics kicks in, the transformation starts, generating bursts of AE events. All of these events are located inside the sample. And after the sample is recovered, one can see these clean-cut, thorough faults throughout this the 12 millimeter sample.
1 minute.
Similar cells can be readily applied to plastic deformation on complex rock samples up to this pressure or maybe slightly higher. And if the pressure is even lower, such as in crustal conditions, conceivably one can use a large sample to study stick slip transformation, frictional faulting in this device to understand brittle deformation and rock earth science, earthquake physics. So we have these potential directions to go of brittle failure at high pressure, deformation of complex rocks, crustal rocks, and some velocities of deformed rock samples to quantify texture and anisotropy. To go smaller, we can go to 50 GPa currently using the second stage configuration in the D-dia-30 by using a 8 sinter diamond anvils. This is in collaboration with Zhi Chengjun at Case Western University, now in China, Bin Chen at Hawaii, and Kurt Leidenweber at ASU. 50 GPa has been demonstrated to be able to reach routinely using this configuration. This is an excellent tool for studying deep mantle petrologies, conducting equation of state studies to understand the fate of subducting slabs in the lower mantle. So I'll skip the user support. You can read this. We have the full support for users for cell parts and anvils. We have a preparation lab that user can use, and we have conducted multiple user training workshops, including multi-anvil techniques, high pressure tomography, acoustic emissions, and we have also support offline experiments for users. So if you are interested, please contact us with these emails, and you can check the website. I want to put this up to finish my experience. I particularly would like to thank NSF for supporting the individual development projects. Over the years, we've obtained multiple grants. These grants have supported many postdocs. A lot of them have moved on to academic positions. This have helped us greatly in the development of new techniques. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yanbin. Very nice and exciting presentation. We have one question. Guillaume, could you please unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot, Yanbin. Your presentation was a very excellent reason for staying awake here. And I have a question regarding the melt structure, because the one important point is acquisition time, and how when you have to keep the sample in the liquid state for the acquisition. So could you detail a bit what was the acquisition time for your experiment on MGS-03, for example, and what could be the evolution with the upgrade of APS?
That's a super good question. Thank you, Guillaume, for that. I actually forgot to mention that. So we started at during the developmental time, it took maybe about roughly an hour to collect the data. Now it's down to about 30 minutes, somewhere between 10 minutes and 30 minutes to collect quite reasonable spectrum for the melt using the monochromatic diffraction. The multi-angle high energy energy dispersive technique we have been using at HPCAD in comparison will take a few hours, because it requires typically about a dozen angles, especially at high angles. It requires a very long time to collect the data to get the information above the background. So that's very good. That's actually a significant improvement because of the double focus beam, monochromatic beam at 13 IDC. With the APS upgrade, because the beam gets smaller and we can fold essentially all the photons into the 30 by 60 micron, maybe even smaller in the future beam size. So my expectation is we can probably improve the time by a factor with the same kind of a quality of data, at least a factor of 100. Of course, that requires, I would say, requires a improved multi-channel collimators. We need finer slit arrays to do that, but it's very feasible to do the melt data structure study within a minute.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That will be a very important improvement to increase the pressure and temperature range potentially. Yeah.
Yes, then we will be able to heat to much higher temperatures because we don't rely on the stability of the furnace to stay stable for like half an hour or something like that.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.